England has a long line of kings and queens, each known for their infamy and prestige. But one king's will change England, breaking from the traditions of Rome in strive to have a son. This is the history of Henry VIII. Henry Tudor was the third child and second son of King Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. He was born at the Palace of Placenta in Greenwich on the 28th of June 1491. At the age of 2, Henry was made Constable of Dover Castle and Lord Warden of the Civic Ports. At the age of 3, he was appointed Earl Marshal of England and Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, and soon after a Knight of the Bath. The day after, Henry was made Duke of York. As Henry was the second son, his older brother Arthur was the heir apparent. Little is known about Henry's early years. As a royal child, he would have received an education from leading tutors of the time, and Henry became fluent in Latin and French. It is believed that Henry was partly tutored by his mother during his early years, learning to read and write, but more importantly, he was raised in the style of a Yorkist prince. In 1501, Henry played a considerable role in the ceremony surrounding his brother's marriage to Catherine of Aragon, and the Tudor dynasty looked set to continue through Arthur. Tragedy struck on the 2nd of April 1502 when Arthur died of the sweating sickness, just 20 weeks into his marriage. Henry was then thrust into the duties of heir apparent and was strictly supervised and did not appear in public. Henry VII died on the 21st of April 1509, and Henry, aged just 17, became king. Soon after his father's burial, Henry declared that he would marry Catherine, and the two were married at the Friars' Church in Greenwich on the 11th of June 1509. Both Henry and Catherine were crowned together at Westminster Abbey on the 24th of June 1509. 2 days after the coronation, Henry ordered the arrest of two of his father's most unpopular ministers and had them executed for high treason in 1510. Early into their marriage, Catherine conceived and gave birth to a stillborn girl on the 31st of January 1510. A few months later, Catherine was once again pregnant, and on the 1st of January 1511 she gave birth to a son, Henry. Sadly, this child died 7 weeks later. Catherine had two stillborn sons in 1513 and 1515, but gave birth in February 1516 to a girl, Mary. Henry's marriage to Catherine was, for the most part, good, though at times strained. It is well known that Henry took mistresses, the most significant being Elizabeth Blunt, whom gave birth in June 1519 to the king's son, Henry Fitzroy. In 1513, Henry invaded France, where he defeated an army at the Battle of the Spurs. Henry had been financially supporting the Holy Roman Empire and Spain in their war against France, but received little in return, and England's coffers were now empty. Henry then signed a peace treaty with France and secured peace for 8 years. In the wake of the new Ottoman threat, Henry met with the King of France, Francis I, at the Field of Cloth and Gold near Calais in 1520 in an effort to unite the Western kingdoms against this Ottoman threat. But relations soured and Charles V of Spain went to war with France, capturing Francis, while Henry, who had allied with Spain, once again received nothing, and he took England out of the war in 1525. By 1525, Henry had grown more impatient with Catherine's inability to produce a male heir, and became infatuated with one of the Queen's lady-in-waitings, Anne Boleyn. Anne resisted Henry's attempts to seduce her and refused to become his mistress like her sister Mary had done. In his strive for a legitimate heir, Henry began proceedings to annul his marriage to Catherine. What followed became known as the King's Great Matter, where Henry argued that in marrying Catherine he had acted contrary to Leviticus 20:21, and if a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing, he hath uncovered his brother's nakedness, they shall be childless. After much legal and political wrangling, a court was convened to hear the evidence, but in 1529 Pope Clement called the case back to Rome, from which it was clear that it would never re-emerge. Cardinal Wolsey was blamed for the failure of the annulment and was arrested for treason in 1530, but died before he went to trial. Henry now placed Thomas Cranmer, a Protestant reformer, to the position of Archbishop of Canterbury. On the 23rd of May 1533, Cranmer declared Henry and Catherine's marriage null and void. Henry had married Anne in a secret service in the winter of 1532, and in a second service in London in the January of 1533. Then, on the 1st of June that same year, Anne was formally crowned Queen of England. Henry then moved swiftly to convince all of the marriage's legitimacy. With the Act of Succession 1533, Henry declared that Mary was illegitimate and that any children with Anne were to be the next in line of succession. Queen Anne then gave birth to a daughter on the 7th of September 1533 and was later christened Elizabeth in honour of Henry's mother, Elizabeth of York. With the Act of Supremacy in 1534, Parliament recognised Henry as the head of the Church of England, and England broke from its traditions of Rome. Henry and Anne enjoyed periods of calm and affection, but Anne was not the submissive wife that she was expected to be. Her opinionated intelligence made her enemies, and Henry disliked her irritability and temper. After a miscarriage in 1534, Henry saw her failure to give him a son as a betrayal, but Henry's ambition for a son was not his only problem. Henry was met with resistance to his religious reforms, the most prominent resistors being Bishop Fisher and Sir Thomas More, both refusing to take the king's oath. Both men were later executed for high treason in the summer of 1535. With the dissolution of the Lesser Monasteries Act of 1536, a large uprising in the north of England clamoured for the return of papacy in England. The Pilgrimage of Grace presented a real threat to Henry, who promised the rebels a pardon and thanked them for raising issues. But Henry saw them as traitors and did not feel obliged to keep his promises to them. The leaders were later arrested and executed for treason. On the 8th of January 1536, news reached Henry that Catherine of Aragon had died, and his queen was pregnant again. Later that month, the king was unhorsed in a jousting tournament and was badly injured. When news reached the queen, she was sent into a state of shock and miscarried a male child. It was probably this loss that was the beginning of the end for Anne. Between the 30th of April and the 2nd of May, 5 men, including George Boleyn, were arrested on charges of treasonable adultery and sexual relationships with the Queen. Anne was also arrested and sent to the Tower of London. Although the evidence against them was unconvincing, the accused were found guilty and executed on 17th of May 1536, the same day that Archbishop Cranmer annulled Henry and Anne's marriage. At 8 a.m. on the 19th of May 1536, Anne was executed on Tower Green. The day after Anne's execution, Henry became engaged to Jane Seymour, who had been one of Anne's lady-in-waiting. The couple were married 10 days later at the Palace of Whitehall in the Queen's Closet by Bishop Gardiner. Jane fell pregnant the year after, and on the 12th of October 1537 gave birth to a son, the future Edward VI. The birth was long and difficult, and Jane died from infections on the 24th of October 1537. Henry's euphoria of finally having a son became sorrow, and it was said that he longed for his wife. During this period, Henry became increasingly paranoid of a Roman Catholic attack on England. Henry now had his heir, but now he needed a spare, and England needed an ally. Henry needed another wife. Having considered the matter, Henry's Chancellor Thomas Cromwell suggested Anne of Cleves, the 25-year-old sister of the Duke of Cleves, who would be an important ally in the face of the Catholic threat. Hans Holbein the Younger was dispatched to Cleves to paint a portrait of Anne. Famously, this picture has gone down in history as being flattering to Anne in order to sway Henry, but it is far more likely that it is accurate, as Holbein remained in favour at court. Henry, now 49, agreed to wed Anne and met her privately on New Year's Day 1540 at Rochester Castle. Henry was disappointed with Anne, feeling that she was not as described. Despite Henry's misgivings, the two were married on the 6th of January 1540 at Greenwich Palace. Though their first night was not a successful one, Henry confided in Cromwell that he had not consummated the marriage, saying, "I like her before not well, but now I like her much worse." Anne was commanded to leave court on the 24th of June, and on the 6th of July informed of the King's decision to reconsider their marriage. Shortly after, Anne was asked for her consent to an annulment, which she agreed. Formally, the marriage was annulled on 9th of July 1540 on the grounds of non-consummation, and Anne was given the title King's Sister along with 2 houses and a generous allowance. Henry and Anne thus became close friends. It was soon clear that Henry had fallen for the 17-year-old Catherine Howard, the Duke of Norfolk's niece. This worried Cromwell, as the Duke was his political opponent, and soon Cromwell fell from favour and was executed. On the same day as Cromwell's execution, the 28th of July 1540, Henry married his 5th wife, Catherine Howard, a first cousin and lady-in-waiting to his second wife, Anne Boleyn. Henry was delighted with his new queen and showered her with gifts of jewellery. Soon after the marriage, Catherine began an affair with a courtier, Thomas Culpeper. Catherine also employed Francis Durham, who had previously been informally engaged to her, and had an affair with her prior to her marriage with Henry, as her secretary. The Privy Council was informed of her affair with Durham, and Thomas Cranmer was dispatched to investigate and brought evidence of the Queen's affairs to the King's notice. Henry at first refused to believe the accusations, but when presented with evidence he blew up in a terrible rage. Culpeper and Durham were both executed on the 10th of December 1541. Then, on the 13th of February 1542, Catherine too was beheaded. In 1542, the remaining monasteries were dissolved and their property transferred to the Crown, which in turn was sold off to bolster Henry's coffers. With Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn dead, relations between Charles V of Spain and Henry improved, and a secret alliance was formed, plunging England into war with France once more. Henry planned an invasion in France for 1543, and in preparation for it, he sent an army north to Scotland, where the Scots were defeated at the Battle of Solway Moss on the 24th of November 1542. In July 1543, Henry once more ventured into marriage. His sixth wife was the wealthy widow Catherine Parr, a reformer at heart whom argued with Henry over religion. She helped reconcile Henry with his two daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, and both were restored to the line of succession in the 1543 Third Succession Act. Henry finally invaded France in 1544, in which he took personal command, capturing Boulogne on the 18th of September. Henry refused Charles' request to march on Paris, and Charles made peace with France, leaving England alone in the war. Francis I of France attempted to invade England in the summer of 1545, but was repulsed in the Battle of the Solent, in which Henry's flagship, the Mary Rose, sank. Financially exhausted, the war ended with the Treaty of Camp on the 7th of June 1546, and England was once again bankrupt. Later in life, Henry became obese with a waist measurement of 54 inches. He had to be moved about by mechanical devices due to an ulcerated leg caused from the jousting accident of 1536. Henry died on the 28th of January 1547 at the Palace of Whitehall. The tomb he had planned was only partly constructed and was never completed. He was interred in a vault at St George's Chapel in Windsor Castle, next to Jane Seymour. Over 100 years later, King Charles I was buried in the same vault. Henry VIII is considered to be one of the most charismatic rulers to sit on the English throne, and his reign was one of the most important in English history.